Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hello, guys. Hope everyone's doing well. My name is... Uh, what was I saying? We're watching a video, obviously. Great intro. Original link to the video from Mega Projects, top of the description, as always, preemptive, like, rebuilding Japan after World War II. Another example of enemy quickly turned ally because of threats after. No matter how big a conflict is, you can talk about how France was dealt with after the Napoleonic Wars, where Europe was ravaged by years and years of awful warfare. And in the end, at the Congress of Vienna, I believe it was called, where they were deciding like what to do to set up Europe. The French, obviously, but also the British, maybe the Austrian side as well, wanted to make sure that France wasn't too weak, despite the terror they caused, because they were worried about Prussian and Russian possible taking advantage of that weakness. And so, no matter how horrific a conflict, it's not surprising to me that you have to look towards the future and well, I feel like I'm speaking too much before I watch.
It's
so
sponsored by
let's
Morning
go.
Brew. Morning Brew is a totally free daily newsletter, and it's just like a rich cup of coffee. It's something that you won't want to start your day without. It's a quick, well-organized look at both light and heavy news that you can receive every day, Monday through Saturday. And I'm telling you, it's pretty great. I've been subscribed for a long time. Who has the time to sit down and watch the news every morning? Who has the stamina to slog through a dry, crusty news section in your local newspaper every day? Who trusts that Twitter is going to vomit up the topics that you actually need to know about? Well, Morning Brew tells me what I need to know, along with some really cool and interesting tidbits that I keep in my back pocket just for conversation starters. So for instance, earlier today, I was reading my most recent copy. I'm recording this on July the 7th. You're probably watching it much, much later though. And it has all of these good bite-sized bits of information. It's got a short profile on what's next for Jeff Bezos, as well as a brief profile on Amazon's new CEO, Andy Jassy. It's also got an explainer about when the best time to pay off your student loans is, an article on the labor shortage that restaurants are trying to deal with right now.
For me, it's small increments every month over decades.
You should know, plus short
It's my
profiles
strategy.
and media and news items that you'll want to keep up with. So yeah, if you like finance, current events, or tech, or even if you just want to keep up with some basic headlines, there's absolutely no reason not to subscribe to Morning Brew. Like I said, it's totally free. It takes about 10 seconds to sign up, and then you get the news in your inbox.
If you're interested, obviously use the link,
below,
guys.
and let's get into the video. As the summer of 1945 dragged on, Japan's situation grew steadily grim, and by the end of July, the nation's ability to conduct major military operations had all but evaporated, and a US invasion of the Japanese mainland it seemed to be imminent. While expressing their undying conviction to fight to the bitter end on one hand, and tentatively reaching out to the Soviet Union to act as a peace mediator on the other, Japanese leaders found themselves in a bit of a difficult situation. 2 separate days in August finally brought Imperial Japan to its knees, with 2 of its cities obliterated by bombs with apocalyptic power. 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki.
And apparently those bombs are but small, tiny fractions of the wield that current nuclear weapons have, so that's comforting. Tsar Bomba, I think, was the biggest ever tested.
Japan's radio waves crackled to life as the everyday men, women, and children for the first time heard the voice of their emperor as he announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The country, which had been devastated by bombs, food shortages, and a catastrophic loss of life, was but a haggard shell of the glorious Japan that it once was. As its cities continued to smolder and the Japanese people faced the reality that their leader's imperial dream had not only collapsed but devastated the country in the process, few would have held much hope for what was to come. With US ships converging on the mainland, it was only a matter of time before the occupation of Japan began and the final humiliation throttled Japan once and for all. However, what came next not only defied expectations, but almost certainly exceeded, well, even the wildest of dreams. Japan's spectacular rise.
I think more so than even the nuclear bombings, the fire bombings. I think if I'm Japan, what would have demoralized me the most was the fact that the allied powers in the world didn't have to split their attention on Europe and Asia anymore. Germany was out of the war, they'd been defeated, and now you are the sole one in the Axis left, and now all attention can be directed towards you, coupled with, of course, the nuclear weapons and America and now the Soviets potentially getting to you. So if I was Japan, I feel like just the fact that the world could focus just on me now would be the most demoralizing thing.
After World War II is one of history's most astonishing reconstruction periods as a country.
Sorry, I wonder what you guys think. If you agree, disagree. Okay.
World War II is one of history's most astonishing reconstruction periods as a country that was teetering on the verge of starvation fought its way back to become the world's third largest economy. The image of the phoenix rising from the ashes.
I think Germany recently overtook them and they're now the fourth, but still very impressive.
Has become a tired, somewhat lazy metaphor. But in this case, there's really nothing more appropriate. Today, this is the story of a shattered Japan and its quite extraordinary ascent after 1945. When the Japanese surrender was formally signed on the 2nd of September 1945, it brought to an end a conflict that had seen the country's sphere of influence stretch deep into mainland China and included Korea, the Philippines, Indochina, Malaysia, Burma, today Myanmar, Siam, now Thailand, and
guys, I watched this a video on this moment here, and it like colorized video, and something that was kind of funny or interesting to me is that they had two documents, one for the Allied powers and one to hand over to the Japanese emperor. Fast forward if you want, if you're not interested. But I believe the Canadian, so you had one person from each of the Allied powers, Soviet Union, US, UK, France, Canada, China, Australia, New Zealand, signing the documents. But I believe it was the Canadian delegate who signed on the wrong line, and so they had to like quickly scratch it out and write like, okay, Canada, like you would on like an essay.
45, it brought to an end a conflict that had seen the country's sphere of influence stretch deep into mainland China and included Korea, the Philippines, Indochina, Malaysia, Burma, today Myanmar, Siam, now Thailand, and countless small islands in the Western Pacific. But 1942 was the pinnacle for Imperial Japan, and with the Doolittle raid in April, the first US bombing raid on Tokyo, the Japanese people were given a glimpse of the horrors that would come. As it all began to unravel and
the Doolittle raid was the first punch back from the Americans to the Japanese on the Japanese mainland. It had nothing to do with like destructive power. It was just the first time since Pearl Harbor that America struck back and showed that they could strike back at mainland Japan. And America didn't even have a bomber capable of doing that could make it back to the aircraft carrier or Guam or whatever. So they actually had to fly to Japan just to send a message, not like a tactical, meaningful bombing, but to bomb Japan to let them know the USA can reach them. And then they would have to ditch the plane in China and then parachute out in China. So Doolittle raid, very interesting.
The country commenced a desperate defense stand. The empire withered and then collapsed as Japanese troops were pushed back all across Asia. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki signaled the end of a hellish period when Japanese cities were hit first by precision bombing raids, then catastrophic firebombing as the US switched tactics and tried to break the Japanese spirit. On the 10th of March 1945, Tokyo was hit by the single most destructive air raid of the war, an attack that all but devastated 41 square kilometers, that's 16 square miles of buildings, and it killed 83,793 people, injuring a further 40,918 and leaving 1 million people homeless. Over the coming months, that carnage was shared generously around as major and smaller cities were hit, often principally targeting manufacturing and transportation, though urban centers also received plenty of attention. As the skies filled with B-29 bombers, over 1.3 million children were evacuated from major major cities to stay with family in the countryside, while over 446,000 were relocated to Buddhist temples, inns, and local families. Now, the level of destruction that had been handed out only really became clear once the formal surrender had taken place aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The bombing raids on Japan had killed between 350 and 500,000 civilians, while the country now faced a 4.2 million unit housing shortage across the ravaged country.
So the fire bombings were many times more destructive than even both nuclear bombings combined.
And over 8.5 million people were homeless. 40% of urban areas had been destroyed, along with more than 600 major industrial facilities. This is before we even talk about food production, transportation links, ports, airfields, schools, hospitals, and, well, just about everything else you would expect in a modern country. Japan had been decimated, and the scale of the rebuild was just difficult to comprehend. Things were chaotic and further aggravated by the sheer numbers returning to Japan. Over 5.1 million Japanese people returned in the year after the country's surrender, with another million in 1947. Add in the hundreds of thousands of decommissioned soldiers, and you begin to get an idea of the absolute pandemonium going on in the immediate months and years after the surrender.
I think it was a very fortunate thing that America did not witness the amount of destruction that the Soviets, that the Chinese, that the French, that the British witnessed. Because when you have a giant power like America coming in that doesn't have the same animosity towards the people they're occupying, I feel like it could have been much worse. Am I playing too much into American kind of propaganda here? I'm not sure, but
the unenviable task of not only rebuilding Japan, but also instigating radical social and political reform fell to General Douglas MacArthur, who was given the title of Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP. During the war, an Allied plan to divide responsibility for Japan between the Allied nations had been agreed upon, but after the country's surrender, the US assumed control of the entire mainland, with the Soviet Union administering smaller islands. It's never been fully explained why this happened, but it almost
to avoid well, one, because I feel like they knew that they didn't have a crystal ball to see the future, but they knew that that the end of World War II isn't the end of history, and that you're going to have conflicts mainly with the Soviets, and they didn't want Japan to be split in a way that Germany was split up. And so I feel like that's why America really pushed to make sure they had total control.
Certainly had something to do with the American distrust of the Soviets, which was growing pretty rapidly. When General MacArthur arrived in Japan on the 30th of August 1945, he was faced with a country teetering on the brink of starvation. Average adult calories a day fell to just 1,042, about 65% of the minimum caloric intake for a healthy adult. The heavily populated cities fared worse, with rations often delivered sporadically. Those living in Tokyo received only 70% of their allocated rations, meaning that for 6 months in 1946, adults in Tokyo were surviving on just 775 calories per day.
Jesus.
To put that in perspective, the average American adult today consumes around 3,600 calories. I don't mean to pick on the Americans there, but they are top of the table, with the British just a few hundred calories behind. We are the greediest of the greedy. Emergency food funds began to reach Japan, but the scale of the crisis was enormous. Wheat donations from the United States also arrived, but quickly developed into a political matter as the Koreans, who were also suffering from severe food shortages, objected to the vast quantities of food arriving in Japan rather than Korea. This was partly spurred on by propaganda spun by the USSR, but it did force the US to distribute more.
Interesting. So the USSR, see, that right there, along with the way that America went and occupied Japan, along with the possible propaganda that the Soviets propped up in Korea, shows you that before World War II was over, the Cold War had kind of started, or at least the seeds were planted
more evenly to keep the peace. Apart from the food shortage, General MacArthur had plenty to keep him busy. The vast majority of politicians linked with the military were removed from office, while a total of 28 found themselves at the Second War Crimes Tribunal after World War II, which began in Tokyo on the 29th of April 1946. 7 were hanged for their roles in the conflict, 16 were given life sentences, 2 died while standing trial, and 1 was deemed mentally unfit for trial. But one man who escaped punishment was Emperor Hirohito.
That's horrifying that somebody that had such a high position that they would be tried as a war criminal was deemed mentally unfit is pretty horrifying in and of itself.
Now, this was a highly contentious and very sensitive debate. Many in the US administration, and indeed many around the world, felt that the Emperor of Japan needed to answer for what his country had done. President Truman left the decision to General MacArthur, and after careful consideration, decided against placing Hirohito on trial, and instead settled for a reduction in role to little more than a symbolic figurehead. Whether you agree with that decision or not, an emperor in Japan is seen as a god, and the effect of witnessing him being put on trial and perhaps even executed would have been psychologically harrowing for the Japanese people. No doubt some of you watching this believe they fully deserved it, while others probably see the benefit of extending some semblance of an olive.
Yeah, if as much as I might think he would deserve being put on trial as well, people who think only in that line of thought, I don't think are understanding that, like, at the end of World War II, it's not like, okay, history over. The war is over, world peace, and now we just have to provide justice to the people in charge of the losing powers, right? That's not the case, obviously. And so, as much as I agree that Hirohito probably deserved to be held more accountable, I think it's a little naive to think that you can't look forward into the future of how to treat Japan in a way that helps you in the future. Now that I say that out loud, it actually sounds almost less justifiable. I'll be right back, guys. All right, sorry guys, continue.
Branch to a people who, while others probably see the benefit of extending some semblance of an olive branch to a people who are at their lowest moment. With the trials out of the way and food networks beginning to function, the occupying American force turned their attention to social and democratic reform. With the growing menace of the Soviet Union now creeping around the world, the US was eager to establish Japan as a liberal democracy, and who knows, maybe one day they would even become friends again, and the US would start importing vast quantities of Japanese technology, with American children growing slightly plumper, spending hours and hours playing video games designed in Japan. I mean, who could have predicted all of that? Land reform was a key early element as the US sought to break up the traditional stranglehold held by wealthy landowners. Between 1947 and 1949, approximately 23,000 square kilometers, that's just shy of 9,000 square miles of land, 38% of Japan's cultivated land, was purchased from landlords and resold at incredibly low prices to the farmers who actually toiled on the land. During this period, 3 million farmers acquired land through this system that radically altered Japan's social structure. Large financial cliques known as the Zaibatsu, which had monopolized many industries, some for centuries, were also broken up, though this faced stern opposition from the wealthy and influential Japanese, who suddenly began to see their privileged livelihoods come crashing down. The electric utilities were privatized into 9 privately owned, government-granted monopolies in 1951, and this was joined by sweeping change in trade unions, labor laws, and education, in which the country implemented a more US-style high school system. But key to it all was the much-loved US cornerstone of democracy. On the 10th of April 1946, an election that saw a 78.52% turnout among men and a 66.97% turnout among women was held, and from it emerged Japan's first modern prime minister, Shigeru Yoshida. A year later, the new Constitution of Japan was formally...
You know, instituting democracy is great and all, but I'm sure that if the Japanese people somehow chose a government that was not a good match for the Americans, I'm sure America would act a bit less democratic.
ratified on the 3rd of May 1947, which essentially outlawed war as a means to settle international disputes involving Japan and meant it would never build up its military. This soon became a somewhat fluid concept because while the US certainly didn't want to see a fully militarized Japan anytime soon, they also didn't want it to become an open-door invitation to the expanding communist tide to
Exactly like the post-Napoleonic Wars example with France I gave at the beginning of the video. Same thing. Like, yes, they were the power that had caused destruction across Europe, but you have to look at the powers of Prussia and Russia taking advantage of that and then causing you a problem. So, very similar.
The East. As a result, Japan set up its self-defense force in 1954, a military force mandated with defending Japan and assisting with internal issues and environmental disasters. By the end of the 1940s, the US occupation of Japan was coming to a close and formally ended on the 28th of April 1952, though the US retained a presence on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Americans were also careful to secure an alliance with Japan, again no doubt eager to have a democratic buffer state in the area as more and more of the region fell under communist influence. In the immediate years after the occupation, Japan's focus was on manufacturing, with major investments made in electric power, coal, steel, and chemicals. This focus, combined with an excellent education system with the highest literacy rates in the world, by the way, and a work ethic that bordered on the sadistic, led to some of the most astonishing periods of growth ever seen around the world. By the mid-1950s, production had surpassed pre-war levels, and between 1953 and 1965, GDP grew by more than 9% per year, with manufacturing and mining increasing by 13%, construction by 11%, and infrastructure by 12%. Suddenly, not having to siphon off the majority for an absurd war effort was working out rather well for the Japanese, though perhaps slightly ironically it was the Korean War that kick-started this period of growth, with Japanese suppliers working with the United Nations forces stationed in the region. Japan's rise at this point is best described as meteoric and has come to be known as the Japanese economic miracle. The hugely ambitious income-doubling plan, instigated in 1960, aimed to double the size of the nation's economy in just 10 years, with tax breaks, targeted investment, an expanded social safety net, and incentives to increase exports and industrial development. Quite astonishingly, it took them just 7 years, in which the economy grew by more than 10% every year and saw Japan establish itself as one of the first developed nations in Asia. And no doubt this won't come as a great surprise, but Japan's early focus was on providing high-quality mechanical equipment that eventually gave way to the computer age. The average monthly consumption of urban family households doubled from 1955 to 1970, with much of this down to an increase in leisure goods. While things spread to the countryside at a slower rate, they were by no means left out, and with new agricultural machinery appearing along with improved strains of crops, farmers began to reap the benefits of a quickly growing population that suddenly had lots of money to spare. In 1965, Japan's nominal GDP was estimated at roughly $91 billion, but just 15 years later, in 1980, the country had smashed through the $1 trillion mark to hit $1.065 trillion. The devastation that had been meted out to Japan's manufacturing sector during the war in a rather bizarre way proved to be a good thing, because once rebuilt with plenty of shiny new machinery from America to begin with, it was able to easily outperform other countries. The Japanese took American ideas of productivity and business organization and made them their own. Soon, they were producing goods that were superior to anything you could get in the United States or Western Europe. Population control, which had loosely been in place since 1948 as a way of combating food shortages, was lifted, and a nation that numbered 77 million in 1945 nearly doubled to 127 million over the next 50 years. This period also saw large-scale migration as millions left the countryside for work in the cities in response to significant labor shortages when the economy began to skyrocket. During the Meiji period in Japan from 1868 to 1912, around 85% of the Japanese population lived in rural locations, a figure that fell to 50% by 1945. However, by 1970, less than 20% of the Japanese people remained in the countryside as the country's cities swelled with new arrivals. At this point, 1 in every 9 Japanese citizens was living in Tokyo as the city's population moved past the 23 million mark. But in an interesting twist, 1970 also saw the point at which the average farm household income surpassed its urban equivalent. Things wobbled a bit thanks to the oil crisis of 1973, but Japan proved itself resilient and weathered the storm significantly better than most. By the end of the 1980s, the country that had been bombed into oblivion just 35 years before was now the third largest economy in the world, behind the US and the Soviet Union. If the country had dragged itself from the pit of despair after World War II, it now stood proudly among the most developed countries on Earth. What happened in Japan between the end of World War II and 1990 was nothing short of spectacular. The final decade of the 20th century saw the country's economic growth slow significantly, and it has never been able to match the heady days of the 1950s and 1960s. The Japanese people really have to be commended at this point. Yes, there were plenty of very sensible economic decisions made, and certainly the large leg up given by the United States of
no matter, the circumstances of which Japan found itself in, with losing during the greatest conflict in history, the fact that soon after the Cold War started and like, regardless of all the American propping up, this is not something that can happen just anywhere. And you've got to give it to the Japanese people. Regardless of all the help, it's a track record that is just can't be undermined. Just insanely impressive.
The war really helped, but a population that put in plenty of hard work, fostered education, social care, and just plain determination to rebuild their broken country was the real reason Japan was able to succeed so quickly. Perhaps it's easier to begin from scratch.
It's like the opposite of Germany after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, after World War I.
But in the decades following the war, the Japanese people placed the reconstruction of Japan over self-interest. This was an area that had been traditionally strong for many years, but their drive reached levels that are difficult to imagine in other developed countries, especially in the 21st century. In just 35 years, Japan went from being a crushed, hungry country with little to no remaining industry and cities lying in rubble to the very pinnacle of global development.
It's so astounding that if you were to show these statistics to the Japanese imperial officers and politicians during 1942, they would have surely thought, like, the only way this is possible is if we win in World War II,
Success story of astonishing vision and growth that may never be matched. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, smash that like button below. Do me a favor and go get Morning Brew. It's free. There's a link below. And thank you for watching.
Thank you for making. Love Simon, all of his channels, all of the channels that he's a narrator of and a part of them. Love all of them. And it's a very interesting video. As always, I hope all of you are doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. I'm always astounded how amazing you guys and how, many of you often comment in videos. I didn't expect it. I appreciate it a lot. So, hope everyone's doing well, and I hope to see you guys next time. We'll keep on learning together. Bye, guys.